Hello, and welcome to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Alistair McEwen, and for this episode, we looked at possible impacts on the climate environment of AI and data centers with Ketan Joshi, a freelance climate and energy analyst and commentator based in Oslo, in Norway. Ketan is the author of recent analysis into how some big tech companies are greenwashing the potential impacts of AI, and that they are making, in his analysis, misleading claims that AI could help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the long term.
The bulk of their impact is actually coming from something that nobody has asked for. People weren't pounding down the door of Google and saying, please put AI overviews on your searches. This is something that has been induced by them to fabricate demand for a software product that they didn't really have a clear idea of what they wanted to do. And in doing so, it's fabricating demand for fossil fuels as well.
I started by asking Ketan Joshi to explain his concerns around AI and climate change.
I'm a child of the internet, child of the digital age, and I've been using digital technologies my whole life. I'm a technology fanboy and an early adopter of many different things, and many of those things have required data centers, which are localized buildings filled with computers. They replaced this whole system we used to have of offices would just have a computer in the basement. And this really increased the efficiency by having a whole bunch of computers located in one spot rather than having them in the basement of buildings. And these became known as data centers. And actually, that relates to the fact that their original purpose was dealing with storage of data, not really doing computation of things, but just storing files and emails, pictures, etc. After the 2010s, they became a lot more focused on doing live services, things like video streaming, Zoom calls, gaming, like processing information. So gaming can work, particularly like online gaming. And that caused a notable but not bonkers growth in data centers. And that growth occurred at the same time that energy efficiency for data centers also occurred. So in regions where you see a lot of them, like the US, you saw quite a flat demand profile for data centers. They were growing, increasing in number, but the amount of energy they were consuming was not really increasing that much. About 5 years ago, what we saw was the emergence of a different application. This is the generation of text, images, and videos trained on a very large data set of information from all of human creation. So every text, every image, every video created has been captured and used to train a model, a piece of software that can learn the patterns that exist in these data sets. And you can ask that machine to say, okay, based on what you've learned from those patterns, generate something that would look plausibly the same. So you go into a software program and you say, create a picture of a cat for me. And it references all those millions and perhaps billions of images of cats that are based in its training database. And it'll give you a pretty good approximation, an averaged approximation of what a cat is. And this has been deployed as a consumer product from the big tech companies. People know it as artificial intelligence or AI, or specifically generative AI. And it is this specific application that has changed the game for data centers. Data centers now consume very, very significant amount of energy. Any efficiency improvements are very, very quickly swallowed up. And we now see an increase in the energy consumption of data centers being driven by this one consumer product, which is the generation of text, images, and videos. And that is really unusual. When streaming emerged, there was concerns around the size and scale of data centers. When video calling ramped up during COVID, people were also raising concerns about the climate impact of data centers. But this is completely different. And I track the energy and emissions disclosures of big tech companies. If you pop onto my website, you can see some little examples of this. Most of them actually disclose just the amount of energy they consume each year, a pretty straightforward number. Not only has that number been increasing, the amount by which it increases also increases. So this is known as acceleration, which is when you're not just going faster, but you're going faster. This is causing very significant impacts in that this mode of development for what is essentially just a heavy industry, I think it's best to think of it as like a factory or a heavy industry, but one that's growing at a scale that we've never seen any heavy industry grow at in the past, is that it tends to incentivize fossil fuels rather than clean energy. And a lot of people have it in their head correctly that clean energy tends to be cheaper. But when you look at the political, social, and economic dynamics around these developments, even though it would be way cheaper to build renewables, it's often quicker and, I guess, more politically available, particularly in the United States, to build an obscenely huge data center instead. This trend, the emergence of this extremely energy inefficient and power hungry software, paired with the political and social dynamics when you build a massive data center very quickly and very suddenly, which is invariably incentivizing fossil fuels, you just have the very straightforward net effect of worsening climate change. There are other effects on water, on biodiversity. There's also really an understated issue is the supply chain for all the bits and pieces that you make a data center out of, particularly the manufacturing of chips, which is an energy intensive and very complicated process. And then on the receiving end, I guess you could call it, the functions served by generative AI also have a set of effects on climate action. Many different sources of disinformation and flat out lies around climate and energy are now utilizing full-scale fake text, fake videos, fake science papers, 100% of the time, no shame. And people are being showered by it like a tsunami. We've got the energy side of it. The characteristics, the sort of dynamics of a rapid carpet bombing a power grid with a huge amounts of new demand in different parts of the world. And then you've got the other two ends of it, which is the supply chain, what you make it out of. And then you've got the other end of what happens when you have a society that is impacted by generative AI and what happens to climate action in the context of a completely destroyed information space.
So there's the umbrella term of artificial intelligence. And one of the things that you've been researching is that you're really focusing on the generative AI aspect of this as massively increasing demand of energy and other things. There's another part, which is traditional AI. Can we just define those different bits?
My very first job in the energy space was in 2010 at a wind energy company. And one thing that we were doing was analytics around operation of wind farms. So we wanted to really make sure that we scheduled maintenance when there was low wind. And doing that requires very reliable forecasts, because if you get the wind forecast wrong, you've shut them down during some amazing high wind period when you could be capturing all that wind and earning money for the company, but also pushing fossil fuels out of the grid and lowering emissions. And so it was really in our best interest to use the best forecast we could. Even back in 2010, we were running some of these programs, laptops. They were very low energy, quite efficient, trained, of course, on very large data sets of wind, but able to function on a very low energy machine. It was a narrow piece of software that helps you forecast the wind. It can detect patterns, and through that system, it can essentially come up with slightly more accurate forecasts. It shouldn't overstate what it can do, but it helps. And any little bit that it helps makes a big difference to the bottom line of a company and to the emissions on a power grid. This has been referred to in the past as machine learning, or deep learning specifically, because this is something that requires very large data sets of historical wind speeds. But the energy consumption of doing that is very low indeed. You don't need to build a new massive data center the size of a city just to do forecasts for energy. That's important to note. And then also that it's old. It's just been getting incrementally better. And of course, recent developments, it's been getting slightly better, but ultimately still you can forecast sunlight and wind maybe 24 to 48 hours accurately into the future, and then you can get rough forecasts over the course of the next few weeks. That hasn't really changed in 2.5 decades since I began my career. This is the subject of a piece of work that I did recently, funded by a collection of environment and corporate accountability groups. We published a report that examined the way companies talk about AI. You mentioned the word umbrella term. And that was something that we found to be really, really important. Companies, I'll give you an example. Google, for instance, will offer services to help forecast sunlight or wind speeds. And then they'll put that in their sustainability report and go, look, our AI is helping climate change. And then you look at the emissions and energy data that they've got in their report, and it looks awful. Their energy consumption's rising, and consequently their emissions are rising too. And you go, okay, well, how do you reconcile these two things? And of course, what is happening here is that they're using the phrase AI to describe two very different technologies. The wind forecasting thing is a narrow computation, something that is not really consuming a lot of energy, whereas the software service that they provide of a chatbot is consuming massive amounts of energy for a multitude of reasons, not just the inefficiency of creating content from a database like that, but also the way that they force it on users. It's getting triggered every single time you do a Google search. Microsoft does the same thing. Amazon is increasingly doing the same thing. Meta, of course. There's a lot at stake on AI becoming a thing and the value of the companies. So they basically have a cultural inducement to consume as much energy as possible. And these are completely different to helping a solar developer find sites to put solar on rooftops, completely different things. And so what we do is we identify it as a form of greenwashing. It is basically the first time that we've seen the use of this tactic of having a vague umbrella term to justify one very significantly harmful industry with the relatively different technology of another. There's a great quote from the writer Karen Howe. She wrote the book Empire of AI. And there's a great quote where she talks about how a bicycle is a form of transport and so is a rocket. But you would never say, well, I think that transport is going to be good for climate action, because that's absurd. Transport could be great for climate action or it could be terrible depending on the technology you use. There's not really any precedent for this, but the one related issue that people might be quite familiar with is the plastics industry has been promoting the use of single-use plastics, which is an intensely wasteful way to package food and beverages, has an incredible climate impact, a very, very severe biodiversity and ecological impact through waste. But you go onto their website and it'll be like a picture of a medical device, someone using a pipette or something in scientific research to cure cancer. And so in their comms materials and their sustainability reports, etc., they talk about how plastic is a vital component of public life and society. And I've been working with some folks in Australia to increasingly put a focus on what the data center lobby group is doing. You go to their website. I was just looking at it yesterday, and it's all about streaming and emails and ordering something from Amazon and like kind of the day-to-day life stuff. Whereas the bulk of their impact is actually coming from something that nobody has asked for. People weren't pounding down the door of Google and saying, please put AI overviews on your searches. This is something that has been induced by them to fabricate demand for a software product that they didn't really have a clear idea of what they wanted to do. And in doing so, it's fabricating demand for fossil fuels as well.
I was quite interested just to get an idea of the scale of the predicted demand. And things are being pushed on people that they might not necessarily take on in terms of the generative AI offers that there are. But what is the scale, if you can give us an approximate figure?
As you mentioned, there are many different projections of the future for not just the amount of energy that's consumed by data centers over the next decade or so, but also about what powers them. Like, do they incentivize new fossil fuels or nuclear or renewables? With so many different points of uncertainty combined into one figure. But generally, what we see is that data centers will climb from maybe 2% of global demand as they currently are, up to maybe 5 to 6% in the most bullish scenarios of total global electricity demand. They become like a major industry in the same way, steel manufacturing or iron ore processing becomes, right? They start playing with the bigger proportions in terms of heavy industry.
Has there been so far adequate consideration of that in governments? I mean, if you look at the hype around it, which a lot of governments seem to be wrapped up in, there doesn't seem to be a lot of talk about energy demand. I mean, there are various countries that are talking about the benefits rather than the lacunas, perhaps.
Yeah, it's more acute in regions where, the growth is the most intense, where we see regions of intense data center growth. It's much harder to get the consequences out into the agenda of politicians and political groups. And part of the reason is that they are welcoming data center growth as a pathway to stimulating economic growth, stimulating other jobs and things like that. And they see it as a net positive. And so they don't really want to talk too much about the potential risks. But the US, of course, is a region where nearly half of electricity demand growth between 2024 and 25 came from data centers, and the percentage of the total demand in the US is increasing for data centers more than anywhere else in the world. And that is somewhere where it has become an issue, to the extent where Trump is out there basically saying we're going to force data centers to pay their own way. And we can discuss that in a moment. But one thing I wanted to just quickly focus on, just on the issue of projections and forecasts, is that the part of the reason that this is complicated is because a lot of data center developers will throw out project spam. And so they'll propose 7 1 gigawatt data centers, each powered by gas, only really wanting to build one. So you look at the pipeline, or a utility planner looks at their pipeline and goes, oh no, okay, I've got like a very, very significant amount of demand growth coming. And when the reality hits and that gets powered by 1 gigawatt of gas, you still have an additional new gigawatt of gas. Like, it may look or feel like less than what was projected or forecast. But of course, the climate does not respond to what was potentially going to happen. It responds to what actually physically happens. For instance, when we look at the US, a lot of data centers are building gas-fired power stations alongside data centers, literally connected to them and literally powered by fossil fuels. Last year, from 2024 to 2025, America's emissions rose 2% for a mix of reasons. LNGs were expensive thanks to exports, and so that helps boost gas-fired power generation. Rising demand also helps boost gas-fired power generation. Data centers have played a major role in the very first emissions increase economy-wide in the US for quite some time.
So one of the things that you're saying is that the tech companies are actually suggesting that there are climate benefits from this AI, but they're doing that in the way that they're just looping traditional AI into the same bracket as generative AI. There are some small benefits from traditional, but actually there isn't a huge expansion of traditional itself. I just wondered, for example, there's somebody like Nick Stern, who put a report out which suggested there were benefits from AI. What was happening there? Yeah. Maybe if you could go into some of the claims which are maybe not always agreeing with your analysis.
Yeah, actually that study from Stern is included in our report as one of the data sources. And so I've read it and it's actually quite interesting. I highly recommend anyone interested in this topic to go and read through the whole thing. But what we found is that it sort of matches a pattern that we saw in other sources that were quite similar. So what they do is they tend to list a very large number of examples of, and I mentioned one earlier, the wind forecasting, but it happens in many different sectors. You can use AI to model materials to be used for carbon removal, to help manage a transport flow, improve public transport and bike lanes in cities. And then what they'll do is do a piece of economic modeling where they'll assume increases in efficiency for a bunch of different societal processes. And then when you plug that into a model, what you see is decreased greenhouse gas emissions. In our report, we do not critique or analyze that economic modeling. I wish that I had time and the capability to do so in a lot of detail. But what we do critique is that listing. One of the findings that we determined from our work is that generally the evidence put forth when they list examples of the benefits, first of all, they tend to lean on corporate sources. So it'll kind of be like the page of a software provider saying, here are the benefits, which, fair enough. But I don't think that that's a strong claim to basically having an IPCC style working group 3. Here's a list of climate solutions and here's the evidence behind why they work. I think we saw that as working group 3 as a nice standard of analyzing climate solutions, and we compared it to the way that AI climate solutions were presented. And we found a lot of the presentations to be quite wanting. The other way that those claims are presented is that they tend to be netted out. So you'll have the greenhouse gas emissions of data centers. And that Stern study, for instance, does this. They'll come up with an estimate of the total global greenhouse gas emissions of data centers, probably roughly similar to what I said earlier. And then they'll look at their model where they turn the dials up on energy efficiency and productivity. Even when you account for the increased greenhouse gas emissions from data centers, you still see a reduction in total societal greenhouse gas emissions because of the applications of all of these various AI things we've listed. To go from that to claiming a global plummet at the gigaton level of greenhouse gases is not well supported. Reading those studies, not just the Stern one, but from the IEA, from the corporate state published in Nature, you can check out all of these sources. The ones that claim not just a net benefit, but a major narrative shifting level of greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the near term before 2030, I thought were overstated in their claims. We also go through the academic published papers that are referenced, particularly in the IEA report. This is the report called Energy and AI that was published in May last year. Many of those academic papers are quite good. We've shared the full data set of all of the references and things like that we read, including hyperlinks. Some of those studies are really good and interesting. I felt warm and fuzzy reading some of them because they reminded me of my first few years working in the energy industry and all the technologies that can help. But some of them are doing a really similar thing, right, where they extrapolate a small thing. We looked at the energy savings of better routing of vehicles using Google Maps, which used AI to direct cars through more fuel-efficient routes. And they'll go, okay, take that and apply that to the world's transport sector. And then you get these lovely looking numbers of total global transport dropping by whatever amount. I think that's just not a good method. for determining the potential impact of the technologies. As I mentioned before, they're modeling two different types together. Of course, you would have a much better outlook if, first of all, you didn't overstate the benefits, and secondly, you separated out generative AI from these applications of making climate solutions more efficient somehow.
And overall, what should we be doing about this huge increase in data center demand?
Yeah, there's kind of two sides to it, I see. The first is pretty straightforward, which is more disclosure. I know this is something that there's ongoing debates about in climate. I worked in corporate accountability for 2 years, and it radicalized me because disclosure is so important. Some tech companies do it really well. I use a lot of their disclosures in my advocacy and my analysis. But other companies are shockingly bad. I think maybe one nice example is Anthropic. They're a US-based chatbot company, and they also develop automation tools and things like that. They've made this system called Claude, which is very popular. A lot of people that I work with and friends and colleagues really love it. But Anthropic discloses nothing. Anthropic discloses not a single data point about any of their energy or emissions, nothing like that. It's quite remarkable. Anthropic also have been urging the US government to build more gas-fired power stations to power their data centers alongside other technologies. I think that we still have a lot of pushing to do to get even just basic levels of disclosures. Companies also like doing misleading disclosures. So you would have seen Google did this, OpenAI have done this, an organization called Mistral did it too, where they talk about the emissions impact or energy impact of sending one query. You ask a question, write a poem about my kid's birthday or whatever, and they'll go, okay, the average energy consumption of doing that is whatever. It's invariably a very small number. It'll be like 10 seconds of Netflix on a TV or something. But that is not a real representation of their environmental impact, because that doesn't gel with their sustainability reports, which show skyrocketing energy and emissions numbers. If it's like a nothing burger, just like watching Netflix, then you wouldn't expect their emissions reports to be so different to the emissions reports of Netflix. You would expect them to be existing on the same scale. This is something I find really important. There's many other groups pushing for disclosures and protecting the sanctity of having accurate emissions data in the first place. This is the fight behind the greenhouse gas protocol and reporting for different types of emissions, which I won't go into. And the second thing is really just opposing the construction of data centers powered by fossil fuels and built in societally corrosive places or in environmentally destructive ways. You can find many examples of that and many examples of resistance against bad data centers. I think that's important for people to join those fights if they can. And then I put this sort of at the bottom of the tier, but I think something that's really important is trying to resist the over deployment of generative AI in work, life, society. You don't have to be fully against it, but you can actually make decisions not to over deploy it. I liken that very much to the way that somebody might choose to walk to the shops instead of driving a SUV to the shops. It doesn't solve climate change if you do that, but it makes a remarkable amount of difference if you can choose the leaner and better option for you, because these problems emerge through their insidiousness and their stickiness. Once a society starts using an SUV to get to the shops, and everybody starts doing that, you start to see oil demand materially changing. In the same way, as soon as everybody stops using their own brain or a calculator to do a calculation and instead starts asking Chat GPT, what's 2,000 times 5,000, that actually has an impact that is society-wide in the same way that an SUV might.
The battle with SUVs has arguably been lost, hasn't it? Because there wasn't the necessary cultural changes around it.
I see that as a warning sign, like these early weeks and months and years of deployment. This is when the level of insidiousness gets decided. Even just small battles that seem minor, if you can win them and say, like, I'm a writer and a researcher and I won't use generative AI in my work, not only do make that decision myself, but advocate for it to others and try to point out some of the hazards and how it's better for me as someone who is liable as a researcher who gets paid to do work as a freelancer. I'm putting myself at massive risk if I rely on a text averaging engine to come up with facts and figures rather than doing it from the ground up. 2 days ago, I was trying to calculate the emissions intensity of a specific type of gas turbine. I got the EPA figures and I did all the heat rate calculations and all that sort of stuff. I plugged it into Claude. It came up with a really specific looking number that was not what I came up with, but was within the realms of possibility. I asked this software system, like, how did you come up with that? And it's obviously designed to be groveling and apologetic. And it was like, oh, I'm so sorry. I used pattern matching to come up with it. There was no calculation behind it. And I'm just like, wow, I can really feel the decisions that the humans, the people behind the software have made, right? They want it to talk like a person. They want it to feel like a conversation with a real conscious being. They want it to apologize profusely all the time, in the same way that somebody feels like safe in an SUV, despite them being one of the most unsafe technologies to have been introduced to society in recent decades. In the same way, people feel safe talking to Claude because Claude is just constantly apologizing to them, even though the design mechanics of the software, it is not calculating the emissions intensity of a gas turbine. It is not performing a calculation in the same way that I would do so when I'm researching and figuring out a piece of analytics. And this is the way that it spreads through society. This is why every emissions report I look at is just like climbing numbers. To some degree, in the context of your question, we have lost a lot of it already. And I think that's important to acknowledge and not to be too down about it, but a lot of it has been lost already in that it is such a powerful convenience engine and a replacement for cognitive effort that it has really, really just been very effective. Not everywhere, but I think the fight is still worth having.
Do you think there's any possibility to have a nuanced use of generative AI? Wouldn't that be the responsibility of governments to be setting some kind of limits on this?
You've got to put some limits on data center growth, and you'll get hit with a lot of like, this is anti-economic growth, this is anti-government sovereignty, data sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is that most of the capacity of data centers is for purposes that are relatively toxic and not really being critical parts of human society in the same way that a data center that runs a hospital database might be. What I've seen is an emerging movement. They refer to themselves as frugal AI, but this is reconverting generative machine learning or generative AI into what it used to be, which is a narrow system that is a text processing engine that is not a general purpose, ask it anything, do anything system. To get a system like that to work requires massive amounts of energy that's socially harmful. It's actually a narrow engine. And I think a lot of people are starting to have seen this at play. I used to use Grammarly. This is a software system that you put your text in there and it'll give you grammar suggestions and things like that. Grammarly now features expert reviews. What they will do is you put in your text and it'll be like, here are 7 experts giving reviews of your work. And it'll just name 7 people who have nothing to do with the company. It is just a chatbot system that has found the names of 7 people who have written on that topic before. And then it generates recommendations for you to change your text in line with what those people have written. I plugged in an article I wrote. I got a free trial because I wanted to test this out myself. And the recommendations are garbage. And this is what happens when you start switching from an old pattern matching system that just had a narrow purpose and could help a little bit, but not do everything for you, to this generalized system where you have a company that is now taking people's names without their consent, making them expert reviewers for documents. And of course, the energy consumption of this alternative approach is orders of magnitude greater. It is turning it from a normal piece of software that used to exist last decade into something ultra bloated for a worse product. Another example, I use speech to text and text to speech all the time. I'm sure you do too. A lot of people who work with podcasts or audio formats use this a lot. I am not alone in having seen a major degradation in the quality of those systems, and they are awful. They're saying stuff wrong. They're making stuff up. Numbers are wrong. The content gets changed. And it's because generative systems are not narrow and trained to work on a piece of information within constraints. They are fundamentally designed to be creating new stuff. And so when you slap a generative system onto an old machine learning thing that used to work, that just used to be a relatively ordinary old thing that did a narrow job, then again, you get something worse for significantly higher energy consumption. This is a trend that is insidious. I choose that word carefully because I think that people do not immediately detect the problems. You have people writing reports based on Claude output, and they'll put it out and nobody will notice that one of the 20 references was fabricated. Somebody will do a calculation for some critical piece of software, and there's a bug in the code will only emerge in 6 months' time when a user does things in a particular way. You will not be able to link that back to the use of Claude to generate that code. But what will happen is you will just have this generalized air of shitification which is a word created by Cory Doctorow to describe the way software is getting worse, all for an energy cost that is completely unjustified.
Doesn't that the implication that this kind of generative AI and the quality of it could get worse also mean that the hype will disappear?
Yes, I think this is very similar to Bitcoin mining. The hype around Bitcoin mining receded after 2020 and 2021. What many people don't realize is that there are still many projects estimating the energy consumption of Bitcoin mining. And after the hype receded, the energy consumption did not. In fact, it grew to nearly 2 or 3 times what it was in 2021 when everybody was talking about the environmental and climate impacts of Bitcoin mining. In 2024, the consumption roughly matched that of the country of Pakistan, the electrical energy consumption of Bitcoin mining globally. What we will probably see is a lot of the data center pipeline drops off, right? The proposed projects, the stuff that doesn't exist yet, and a lot of the cash that's been pumped into it disappears. But you will still end up with a 7 gigawatt gas plant somewhere that ends up being built and then powering something. Because as soon as fossil fuel infrastructure, pipelines, gas plants, everything else gets locked in, it's hunting for customers constantly. Somebody sits there with a 30-year lifespan on that asset and people to pay back. They have to figure out a use for something. And so then you're left with the fossil fuel infrastructure detritus of a collapsed industry. There will still be continued demand. I mentioned the energy demands of processing that text, and there's actually 2 parts to it. One is training it, which requires a lot of energy. The other part is what's known as inference, or basically just what happens when you ask it a question and it spits out an answer. Both of those are ongoing. So the training has to happen constantly. This is why tech companies are hiring freelance writers to literally just write inputs for the models. That is why the training is ongoing and the power consumption of training is increasing. It's not like they've trained their models and then that's it. It has to be ongoing. Otherwise, the quality degrades very fast and the function degrades very fast. And then inference has to occur very close to where the query is sent, right? So that is not just an ongoing energy cost. It's an ongoing incentivization of the construction of data centers near population centers. And so those 2 factors, even if you were to see the bubble burst, you will still end up with relatively decent energy consumption. And worse still, probably what would happen is less scrutiny.
But you could say that's the same for the overall picture on climate change, really, in the sense that this is an example of how things are going the wrong way. We're heads in the sand on just about everything now.
Data centers are not the biggest climate issue by a decent margin. There's much bigger single issues that even if you just were to measure it in just raw emissions that are much bigger. And we will obviously all be working on them throughout our lives. But data centers really hit this moment of the confluence of many different factors. And that's why I've been focusing on it, because I think that it's really a way of reminding people that none of these bad decisions are inevitable. We may end up in 10 years' time with this digital equivalent of SUVs all over the internet and our social media spaces and workspaces, but maybe not. Maybe we can find a better way through.
Thanks very much to Ketan Joshi for his time. As usual, we have a further reading list provided by Ketan that you can find in our podcast blurb and on our Land and Climate website. Thank you to Vasko Kostovsky for audio engineering the show as well. On our website, where you can also find a new investigation carried out by Bertie on the UK government funding a controversial CCS project in China. That's a carbon capture and storage project in China. I always say this, but please do try to review our podcast if you liked it, as it will help others to find us. And we'd also like to get your feedback. And we'll be back again with another interview in 2 weeks' time. I'm Alistair McEwen, and thanks for listening.